Hiber-Nation 3. Grizzly's Growls presents Stories of the Hiber-Nation. The following stories are either from the public domain or read by permission of the author, who retains all rights. In either case, I'm reading these stories because I like to read stories. And, well, that's it. I hope you enjoy listening. Pull up a chair. The Biography of a Grizzly by Ernest Thompson Seton, as read by David Grizzly Smith. Part 1. The Cubhood of Wahb. Number 4. Wahb was never sweet-tempered like his baby sister, and the persecutions by his numerous foes were making him more and more sour. Why could they not let him alone in his misery? Why was everyone against him? If only he had his mother back, if he only could have killed that black bear that driven him from his woods. It did not occur to him that some day he himself would be big, and that spiteful bobcat that took advantage of him, and the man that tried to kill him. He did not forget any of them, and he hated them all. Well, Wahb found his new range fairly good, because it was a good nut year. He learned just what the squirrels feared he would, for his nose directed him to those little granaries where they'd stored up great quantities of nuts for winter's use. It was hard on the squirrels, but it was good luck for Wahb, for the nuts were delicious food, and when the days shortened and the nights began to be frosty, he'd grown fat and well-favored. He traveled over all parts of the canyon now, living mostly in the higher woods, but coming down at times to forage almost as far as the river. One night, as he wandered by the deep water, a peculiar smell reached his nose. It was quite pleasant, so he followed it up to the water's edge. It seemed to come from a sunken log. As he reached over toward this, there was a sudden clank, and one of his paws was caught in a strong steel beaver trap. Wahb yelled and jerked back with all his strength and tore up the stake that held the trap, tried to shake it off, and then ran away through the bushes trailing it. He tore at it with his teeth, but there it hung, quiet, cold, strong, and immovable. Every little while he tore at it with his teeth and claws, or beat it against the ground. He buried it in the earth and then climbed a low tree, hoping to leave it behind, but still it clung, biting into his flesh. He made for his own woods and sat down to try to puzzle it out. He did not know what it was, but his little green-brown eyes glared with a mixture of pain, fright, and fury as he tried to understand his new enemy. He lay down in the bushes, and, intent on deliberately crushing the thing, he held it down with one paw while he tightened his teeth on the other end, bearing down as it slid away, and the trap jaws opened, and the foot was free. Now, it was mere chance, of course, that led him to squeeze both springs at once. He did not understand it, but he did not forget it, and he got these not very clear ideas. There is a dreadful little enemy that hides by the water and waits for one. It has an odd smell. It bites one's paws, and it's too hard for one to bite. But it can be got off by hard squeezing. Now, for a week or more, the little grizzly had another sore paw, but it was not very bad if he did not do any climbing. It was now the season when the elk were bugling on the mountains. Wahb heard them all night. Once or twice he had to climb to get away from one of the big antlered bulls. It was also the season when the trappers were coming into the mountains and the wild geese were honking overhead. There were several quite new smells in the woods, too. Wahb followed one of these up, and it led to a place where some small logs piled together. And then, mixed with the smell that had drawn him, was one that he hated. He remembered it from the time he'd lost his mother. Well, he sniffed about carefully, for it was not very strong, and learned that this hateful smell was a log on front, and the sweet smell that made his mouth water was under some brush behind. So he went around, pulled away the brush till he got the prize, a piece of meat, and as he grabbed it, the log in front went down with a heavy chuck. Made Wahb jump, but he got away all right with the meat and some new ideas, and with one old idea made stronger, and that was, when that hateful smell is around, it always means trouble. Now, as the weather grew colder, Wahb became sleepy. He slept all day when it was frosty. He had not any fixed place to sleep in. He knew a number of dry ledges for sunny weather, one or two sheltered nooks for stormy days. He had a very comfortable nest under a root, and one day, as it began to blow and snow, he crawled into this and curled up to sleep. The storm howled without. The snow fell deeper and deeper. It draped the pine trees till they bowed, and then shook themselves clear to be draped anew. It drifted over the mountains and poured down the funnel-like ravines, blowing off the peaks and ridges and filling up the hollows level with their rims. Piled up over Wahb's den, shutting out the cold of the winter, shutting out itself, and Wahb slept and slept. Number 5. He slept all winter without waking, for such is the way of bears. And yet when spring came and aroused him, he knew that he'd been asleep a long time. He was not much changed. He'd grown in height, and yet was but a little thinner. He was now very hungry, and forcing his way through the deep drift that still lay over his den, he set out to look for food. There were no pinon nuts to get, and no berries or ants, but Wahb's nose led him away up the canyon to the body of a winter-killed elk, where he had a fine feast, and then buried the rest for future use. Day after day he came back till he'd finished it. Food was very scarce for a couple of months, and after the elk was eaten, Wahb lost all the fat he had when he awoke. One day he climbed over the divide into the Warhouse Valley. It was warm and sunny there. Vegetation was well advanced, and he found good forage. He wandered down toward the thick timber, and soon smelled the smell of another grizzly. This grew stronger, and led him to a single tree by a bear trail. Wahb reared up on his hind feet to smell this tree. It was strong of bear, and was plastered with mud and grizzly bear hair far higher than he could reach, and Wahb knew it must have been a very large bear that had rubbed himself there. He felt uneasy. He used to long to meet one of his own kind, yet now that there was a chance of it, he was filled with dread. No one had shown him anything but hatred in his lonely, unprotected life, and he could not tell what this other older bear might do. As he stood in doubt, he caught sight of the old grizzly himself, slouching along a hillside, stopping from time to dig up the quamash roots and wild turnips. He was a monster. Wahb instinctively distrusted him and sneaked away through the woods and up a rocky bluff where he could watch. Well, then the big fellow came up on Wahb's track and rumbled a deep growl of anger. He followed the trail to the tree, and rearing up, he tore the bark with his claws, far above where Wahb had reached. Then he strode rapidly along Wahb's trail, but the cub had seen enough. He fled back over the divide into the Meeteetse Canyon, and realized in his dim, bearish way that he was at peace there because the bear forage was so poor. Well, as the summer came on, his coat was shed, his skin got very itchy, and he found pleasure in rolling in the mud and scraping his back against some convenient tree. He never climbed now. His claws were too long, and his arms, though growing big and strong, were losing that suppleness of wrist that makes cub grizzlies and all black bears great climbers. He now dropped naturally into the bear habit of seeing how high he could reach with his nose on the rubbing post whenever he was near one. He may not have noticed it, but each time he came to a post after a week or two away, he could reach higher, for Wahb was growing fast and coming into his strength. Sometimes he was at one end of the country that he felt was his, and sometimes at another, but he had frequent use for the rubbing tree, and thus it was that his range was mapped out by posts with his own mark on them. One day late in summer he sighted a stranger on his land, a glossy black bear, and he felt furious against the interloper. As the black bear came nearer, Wahb noticed the tan-red face, the white spot on his breast, and the bit out of his ear, and last of all the wind brought a whiff, and there could be no further doubt. It was the very smell. This was the black coward that chased him down the piney long ago. But how he had shrunken! Why, before he had looked like a giant. Now Wahb felt like he could crush him with one paw. Revenge is sweet, Wahb felt, though he did not exactly say it, and he went for the red-nosed bear. The black one went up a small tree like a squirrel. Wahb tried to follow as the other ones once followed him, but somehow he could not. He did not seem to know how to take hold now, and after a while he gave it up and went away, although the black bear brought him back more than once by coughing in derision. Now later on that day, when the grizzly passed again, the red-nosed one had gone. As the summer waned, the upper forage grounds began to give out, and Wahb ventured down to the lower Meeteetse one night to explore. There was a pleasant odor on the breeze, and following it up, Wahb came to the carcass of a steer. A good distance away from it were some tiny coyotes, mere dwarfs compared with those he remembered. Right by the carcass was another that jumped about in the moonlight in a foolish way. Now, for some strange reason, it seemed unable to get away. Wahb's old hatred broke out. He rushed up, and in a flash the coyote bit him several times before, with one blow of that great paw, Wahb smashed him into a limp, furry rag, broke in all his ribs with a crunch or two of his jaws. Oh, but it was good to feel the hot, bloody juices oozing between his teeth. Now the coyote was caught in a trap. Wahb hated the smell of the iron, so he went to the other side of the carcass, where it was not so strong, and had eaten but a little before clank, and his foot was caught in a wolf trap that he had not seen. But he remembered that he had once before been caught and escaped by squeezing the trap. So he set a hind foot on each spring and pressed till the trap opened and released his paw. About the carcass was that smell he knew stood for man, so he left it and wandered downstream. But more and more often he got whiffs of that horrible odor. So he turned and went back to his quiet pinon benches. Thanks for listening to Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Comment on the website at grizzly.libsyn.com. This program is sponsored by donations from people like you and is released with a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.